In this episode, we'll look at the third decade of Neil Young's recordings. We'll look at what happened in the 1980s. Now, you would think that after the huge successes and the ditch issues of the 70s, that Neil might want to take a break. But that's not Neil Young. In the 1980s, he recreates himself, fights with his record label and with MTV, and wins both of those fights. He keeps us rocking in the free world. So are we ready? Let's take a look at the 1980s with Neil Young, and let's drop the needle. Now, as the 1980s start, Neil Young is pretty distracted, and for a very good reason. His son Ben is born with him and Carrie Snodgrass, but Ben has severe cerebral palsy, and Neil is actually taking care of Ben 13 hours a day. Neil's first album in the 1980s is a soundtrack album to a movie called Where the Buffalo Roams. It's a story about Hunter Thompson, and it stars Bill Murray and Peter Boyle. But the movie got really rotten reviews, and in fact, Leonard Maltin even said that even with Neil Young's songs, nothing could save this dreadful movie. Neil has 7 songs on the soundtrack: Buffalo Stomp, Ode to Wild Bill No. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, Home, Home on the Range, and Buffalo Stomp Refrain. After the disappointment of Where the Buffalo Roams, Neil decides to release an album. It's his 11th studio album, and it's called Hawks and Doves, and it largely contains songs that he had written way back in 1974. And the album is kind of a mess. Side 1 is mostly old songs from 1974 to 77, and Side 2 has songs that he recorded specifically for this album. The album opens with Little Wing. No, not the Jimi Hendrix cut, but a song from Neil originally recorded for the Homegrown album. Then we get The Old Homestead, Captain Kennedy, and Hawks and Doves. The album reached number 30 on the charts, but frankly, it's not one of my favorite Neil Young albums. But Neil now is hitting his stride in the 80s and decides to record an album with Crazy Horse and gets them back together. In 1982, they released an album called Reactor, and it's a bit raw, and some of the songs are kind of repetitive. Listen to Surfer Joe and Mow the Sleaze. Then there's T-Bone, which Neil says was a one-take wonder, improvised in the studio as they recorded it. I also like Southern Pacific, Motor City, and Shots. The album didn't really sell very well and was poorly received by the critics. And Neil thought that the problem really was that the label, Reprise, his label, didn't promote it. So he decides he'll leave Reprise, and he signs a contract with David Geffen's label. His first album for the David Geffen label is called Trans, and it's unlike any other Neil Young album. In it, he makes great use of a synclaver and a vocoder and changes the sound of his voice. Now, if you remember, I said at the start of the episode that his son Ben had severe cerebral palsy, and Neil thought that by putting his voice through the vocoder and changing the way that he sounded, it reminded him of the way that he and Ben tried to communicate with each other. The album is really a combination of 2 different recording locations and 2 different ideas. Neil had started recording an album that he was going to call Island in the Sun, but he abandoned that, and some of those songs appear on Trans. The 3 songs from Island in the Sun are the lead-off, Little Thing Called Love, Hold On to Your Love, and Like an Inca. The rest of the album is all vocoder and weird sort of computer effects. I Like Computer Age, Transformer Man, Sample and Hold, and his remake of Mr. Soul. Neil went out on tour to support this album, but his fans were really divided on how they felt about what he was doing. Some really liked it, some really hated it. Now for me, I actually like this album, and I find it's one of Neil's that I keep going back to listen to again and again. It's pretty unique. But David Geffen, he hated the record. In fact, Geffen was so upset with trans that he pleads with Neil to make a rock and roll album. Well, this gets Neil thinking, what constitutes rock and roll? So he decides that he's going to go back to the rockabilly phase where rock and roll kind of started. So he gets a new group called Shocking Pinks, and he records a new album called Everybody's Rockin'. The album contains some covers of early rockabilly songs and then some new ones written in the style by Neil. The album opens with Betty Lou's Got a New Pair of Shoes. Then there's Raining in My Heart, Kinda Fonda Wanda, Bright Lights Big City, Mystery Train, and Everybody's Rockin'. Fans didn't know how to take this album, and it didn't sell well. Based on the failure of these two albums, David Geffen decides he'll sue Neil Young for $3 million because he claims that Neil Young is putting out records that doesn't sound like Neil Young. So in fact, he's suing Neil Young for being Neil Young. Well, Neil countersues for $21 million, stating that his contract clearly states that there'll be no interference from the record label. Eventually, David Geffen backs down and apologizes to Neil. 1984 marks the first year in Neil's career that he doesn't release an album. But back in 1982, he had recorded an album called Old Ways, but David Geffen had rejected it. So Neil decides he'll go back and revisit that album and rework it. And it is dramatically different than the first take on that album, which was rejected. In this album, Neil returns to his country folk roots. It opens with the old standard, The Wayward Wind. Then there's Get Back to the Country, Are There Any More Real Cowboys, Misfits, California Sunset, Old Ways, and Bound for Glory. In 1985, Neil joins up with Willie Nelson and John Mellencamp to create an organization called Farm Aid to help local farmers. And this came about because Bob Dylan made a comment at Live Aid that wouldn't it be great if some of that money was to go to farmers. So Neil, Willie, and John Mellencamp decide to start something called Farm Aid, and they hold concerts every year to support the farmers. And this has been going on every year since 1985. In 1986, Neil releases his 15th studio album. It's called Landing on Water, and it's a return to a more rock sound. Tracks include Weight of the World, Hippie Dream, Hard Luck Stories, I Got a Problem, and Drifter. Neil doesn't really like this album. In fact, he's been quoted as saying, "It's a piece of crap, let's be honest." And he's also said that because his relationship with Geffen was deteriorating, he just needed to put something out. So this is the album he put out. It got very mixed reviews. And then the next year, in 1987, Neil releases an album, again with Crazy Horse, called Life. And it turns out to be the last album that he's going to release on the David Geffen label. The lead off is Mideast Vacation, Long Walk Home, I Like Inca Queen, Prisoners of Rock and Roll, and We Never Danced. But Life did not sell, and in fact, it is the least successful album that Neil has made. Neil has left David Geffen's label and decides to return to Reprise and record a new album. He's going to use a backup blues band and even a horn section, and he calls the album This Note's for You. And the single, the title track, is his first hit single for the 1980s. And in his music video for it, he pokes fun at corporate advertising and even at Michael Jackson. As a result, MTV banned the music video. Well, Neil sends MTV a note, and he says, "What does the M in MTV stand for? Music or money?" And then, at the end of the year, when MTV gives awards for their music videos, guess who won the best MTV music video of the year? Neil Young for This Note's for You. Other songs on the album include Coupe de Ville, Twilight, Sunny Inside, Married Man, One Thing. The album had modest sales. It got to 61 in the US and 56 in the UK. In the fall of 1988, Neil reunites with Crosby, Stills, and Nash, and they record their second Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young album called American Dream. When Crosby was having all of his major drug issues, Neil said he would only rejoin the group if Crosby got his act together and got off drugs. Well, when Crosby ended up being arrested and spending 5 months in a prison in Texas, he kicked the drugs. So Neil was true to his word, and this album is a result of that. Neil wrote 3 songs on the album: the title, American Dream, Name of Love, and Feel Your Love. He also co-wrote with Stephen Stills Got It Made, Driving Thunder, and Night Song. The album peaked at number 16 and makes it the highest-selling album that Neil had in the 1980s. To close out the 1980s, in 1989, Neil releases an album called Freedom, and this album basically resurrects Neil's solo career after the disastrous turns that he had in the middle of the 80s. The album opens and closes with the same song, Rocking in the Free World. The opener is acoustic, the closer is electric. I also like Crime in the City, 60 to 0 Part 1, Don't Cry, El Dorado, Wrecking Ball, and No More. It reaches number 35 in the US and 17 in the UK. Now, at this point in the episode, I would direct you to Spotify so that you could listen to some of the songs I've talked about. But if you've seen the other 2 episodes that I've done on Neil, you know that Neil's songs are not on Spotify. So instead, I would direct you to Neil's website, neilyoungarchives.com, for information about Neil and his music. The 1980s turned out to be quite a decade for Neil Young. He recorded 11 albums. He tried out lots of different musical genres, some successful, some not. He switched record labels twice, and he reunited with Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And he never stopped touring. But in the next episode, you'll see what he does in the 1990s. After all, this is Neil Young, and you know there are going to be some surprises. Thanks for watching, and keep a rockin' in the free world.
If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.